31st October 2008, residents of Valley View apartment complex in Redmond, Seattle, decided to host a Halloween party. As it happened, Halloween fell on a Friday that year, so the partygoers were in no hurry to wind down. It went on till the early hours of next morning, Monday, 3rd November, around 9 a.m. Police in Redmond, Washington, received a call informing them of a suspicious death in Valley View apartment complex. This was unusual, as that particular area of Redmond was one of the safest. There was only one other reported murder that year. That is not to say there was no crime at all, but comparatively, it was an area where one did not hear of violent crimes that often. In this instance, though, it was clear that this was a case of homicide, and a particularly violent one at that. Front door of the said apartment bore signs of recent break-in. Inside of the apartment was in complete disarray. There were clear signs of struggle. The whole apartment reeked of bleach, like someone had tried to clean up after. They followed the trail to the bedroom, where they found the body of a 24-year-old woman. Arpana Jinaga, a technology professional from India. She had moved to America to pursue her master's degree. She was a child prodigy, an excellent student, and a budding motorcycle rider who had recently joined a motorcycle club. In today's video, let's get into the details of unsolved mystery of Arpana Jinaga's murder and how, more than 16 years later, they are no closer to finding her killer. Arpana Jinaga was born in India to Professor B.C. Jinaga and Nirmala Jinaga. Professor B.C. Jinaga was a professor of computer science. Following in her father's footsteps, Arpana was a tech prodigy herself. As a teen, she participated and won IEEE hardware design contest. It put her firmly on the path to achieve great things in the field of technology. She had quite a creative side to her as well. As a child, she showed particular interest in art, writing, and gymnastics. As she reached her formative years, it was clear that her true talent lay in technology and computing. Her particular area of expertise was embedded system. In 2005, when she was just 21, Arpana participated in a worldwide design contest for microchip. She managed to get into top 20 among thousands of others and was the only participant from Asia to be featured. None of this came as a surprise to her family, though. They knew she was capable of achieving all that and more. After completing her bachelor's, she moved to New Jersey to pursue her master's in electrical and computer engineering from Rutgers University. She graduated in 2007. At the time of her murder, she was working as a software quality assurance engineer with EMC. She had joined the company in March 2008 and had moved to Valley View apartment in Redmond. There, she lived in apartment 8946 on the top floor of the complex. Arpana was a bubbly character. Wherever she went, she made friends easily. When you move to a new country, one that is so different to everything you have ever known, most people find it hard to find new connections. In my experience, even when they do find new friends, it's usually among or with people from their own community, birds of a feather and all that. But Arpana was different. She wanted a full American experience. Her interests were varied and at times unusual. For example, as soon as she moved to Seattle, she had purchased a motorcycle, no matter that she had never ridden one and had no idea how to. But she planned to learn and become proficient enough to make it her primary mode of transportation one day. She began taking classes soon after and had joined PNW, Pacific Northwest Riders Motorcycle Club. As was her nature, she made friends there too. Before long, she was partaking in long rides through scenic roads along the west coast of Washington with other members of the club. She had also volunteered with Redmond Fire Department and had even taken few rides with the crew, assisting during small incidents around the town. She also volunteered with a few animal shelters in the area. She was taking martial arts classes and had even been part of a music band at one point. In essence, she had accomplished and lived more in her short 24 years of life than most people are able to do even if they live to be 80. Arpana was destined to achieve great things. There was no doubt about that. Her colleagues recall that on that Halloween day, when she came to work, Arpana was bubbling with excitement. She and some of her neighbors had decided to host a party together that evening. They were going to decorate their apartments and it was going to be open for all. Sounds fun on the face of it, but my introverted and overly conscious brain is screaming at the thought of strangers getting access to someone's private space. I cannot imagine ever being comfortable enough to do that. Sitting here, so many years later, I want to scream at this carefree, adventurous girl to be cautious, to not trust everyone that crosses her path, even when I know it is too late for her. That evening, Arpana, a gracious and generous host, opened her door to neighbors and their guests. It all went on for hours. Under normal circumstances, her only worry would have been the cleanup after so many people have been through her place. Investigators believe most people left Arpana's place around 9 p.m. that night and moved on to the other neighbors. But it is hard to say with any certainty. There was no way to accurately say who was where at what time, since at least 24 people or more had attended the party that night. There was an incident involving Arpana and an unknown man later that night. Some of the people who were there at the party remember a man making racially motivated comment to Arpana. She might have had a word with him, but she quickly moved on from the situation and seemed to enjoy the party, so they thought nothing of it. Police believe she returned to her apartment in the early morning hours of 1st November. There are several witnesses who saw Arpana leave the first floor apartment where most of the partygoers that night had ended up. She got back to her apartment and no one saw her alive after that. An important fact to note here, Arpana had only moved to the area 6 or so months ago. She may have made friends easily, but how well can you know and trust a person in just 6 months? Not very well, as it happened. Not one of her neighbors who were at the party came to her aid when she needed the most. Not one of them thought to check on her when she failed to emerge from her apartment for the next 3 days. Her next-door neighbors on either side of her apartment recall hearing muffled sounds coming from her apartment sometime after 3 a.m. on November 1st. They didn't find anything alarming about it at the time. No one suspected she might be in any sort of danger. One of her neighbors would later remember at around 8 a.m. on November 1st, he was woken up by a horrible growling-like sound, which persisted for 20 seconds or so and was followed by a solid thud, like someone or something banged against the wall. He then heard the sound of running water in her apartment, which lasted for about an hour. While he found these sounds strange, he didn't think to go have a look or even make sure she was okay. Arpana had lived away from her family for some years by now, but she was in regular contact with them. They knew most things that went on in her life. She had spoken to them on the evening of 30th October, a day before the party. As a family, they tried to connect at least a couple of times a week. When she failed to pick up their call that entire weekend, naturally, they were concerned. They didn't have any close family or friends living in the area, at least no one close enough to go check on her on a whim. Luckily for them, one of Arpana's father's former students, Jay, lived close enough, so they reached out to him. By then, it was already Monday morning and Arpana failed to show up to work, raising concerns even further. Monday 3rd November around 9 a.m., Jinaga family friend Jay reached her apartment building. When he got to the top floor, he was probably expecting to knock on her door, find her, maybe a little hungover or under the weather after the party, let her know that her family was worried and was trying to contact her since last couple of days, and be back to work. I imagine that's what he might have thought. He was definitely not prepared for the scene that greeted him that day. He met one of her next-door neighbors. He's identified only as CJ. He met CJ on the way to Arpana's. CJ offered to accompany Jay. They both went to her door and knocked, expecting someone to answer the door. Instead, the door popped open, like someone had forced it open at some point. place where the lock was supposed to be, was broken. Even to their untrained eye, there were clear signs of break-in. Both of them went in and did a quick look around. It was a small apartment. Didn't take them long to find Arpana's body in the bedroom, already in some stage of decomposition. It was Jay who now had to make the phone call to the police, as well as his former professor, with the worst news possible. Within next few hours, her apartment and the surrounding areas were cordoned off, and an inquiry into Arpana Jinaga's murder began. Autopsy showed clear signs of trauma. Whoever had broken into the apartment had subjected Arpana to a violent attack and SA. Autopsy further revealed she had been strangled and asphyxiated to death. Her approximate time of death was November 1st. That means she was lying dead in a pool of her own blood when her family from India were desperately trying to reach her. Because of the state of her body and the stage of decomposition it was in at the time of her discovery, it was harder to tell the exact time of death. So they deemed it could have been anywhere between 3 to 8 a.m. on 1st November 2008, just hours after the Halloween party ended. When officers and investigators had first arrived at Arpana's apartment, they discovered the killer had used brute force to enter the apartment, which had not only been locked at the doorknob, but deadbolt was in place as well. Damage to the door was extensive, and from there, they could see the intruder had proceeded to struggle with Arpana. The apartment was in complete disarray. Things were scattered in a way which made it clear that the struggle had ultimately led to Arpana's bedroom. That is where her body was discovered, nude and bloody, lying face down on the floor beside her bed. She had been posthumously covered in numerous liquids, including bleach and motor oil, which the killer had undoubtedly used to try and cover up the crime scene, which explained the smell of chemical agents and motor oil as soon as the officers had entered the apartment. Inside her bathroom, they found a white comforter stained with blood. It was soaking in the tub in a mixture of water and bleach. Several other items that belonged to the victim, including a green blanket, a red cape she had been wearing to the Halloween party, other pieces of a costume, a black sheet, and portions of carpet had been burned by the killer. In the apartment complex's dumpster, inside the plastic bag, they found a bottle of castor motor oil. It also contained rest of Arpana's Halloween costume, a blood-stained bathrobe, and sheets from her bed, which were conspicuously missing from the crime scene. All in all, it was a well-thought-out murder. There were other items missing from her apartment. Few notable ones are Arpana's BlackBerry phone and digital camera. These items have not been recovered to date. Nothing else of value was taken. More harrowing details came out during the autopsy. Arpana was apparently strangled by her own shoelace. She had also endured, prior to her death, blows to her head. She had broken teeth as a result of struggle with her killer. She was gagged with her own underwear and her mouth was duct taped. Then she was assaulted. They couldn't say with any certainty how long she might have endured the attack. After he had killed her, the killer had scrubbed her body with bleach to eliminate evidence. As if that wasn't bad enough, killer had then sprayed motorcycle oil and other chemicals all over her body, then attempted to light it on fire. But thankfully, he was not successful at that, because motor oil isn't flammable. What that means is it requires higher than 200 Fahrenheit temperature to ignite, which he could not manage with a kitchen match or a small lighter he might have used. Once the autopsy was complete, her body was flown back to India and was handed over to her grieving family. They had supported her dream to make a new life in America wholeheartedly, looking forward to see her achieve great things, both professionally and personally, as she had always done. To have that dream snatched away in such a cruel way, made worse by the fact that they were so far away, not being able to do a thing for their daughter might have been hell. They had sent her off with a heavy heart, wanting her to achieve her heart's desire, to receive her back several years later in a casket. His nightmare come to life. During the coming weeks, investigators reached out to Arpana's family and friends. people who knew her to find out more about her life. Their main focus was the Halloween party. Somehow, they were convinced one of the dozens of attendees was the killer. Every corner of the apartment was searched and tested for any evidence leading them to the killer. Detectives had to whittle down the list of suspects, which initially included a number of guests from the Halloween party. Despite their best efforts, Arpana Jinaga's case did not progress as expected for the next 2 years. After scanning hundreds of DNA samples and numerous witness statements, they were still unable to find concrete evidence against any one person. Then, in October of 2010, 2 years after the incident, Redmond police arrested 27-year-old Emmanuel Demelvin Fair, also known as Anthony Parker. Some years before the murder of Miss Jinaga, Emmanuel Fair was arrested for assault on a minor girl. He was accused of assaulting her at gunpoint and pleaded guilty for the crime to avoid 10+ years of prison sentence. On lesser charges, he began his sentence in 2004 and was let out by 2006 after serving less than 3 years. That was far from his only offense. He was arrested and had served more than 6 times for drug use, firearm-related crimes, and sexual assault. After his release in 2006, he failed to abide by the terms of his release and was put back in prison for probation violations. At the time of Arpana's murder, Emmanuel Fair was homeless and was staying with a friend named Leslie who lived in the same apartment complex as Miss Jinaga. Initially, this Leslie person lied about having Fair with her, but police found several photos from the party in which Fair appeared alongside Leslie. Through witness statements, they also found that Fair had a brief encounter with Arpana that night, nature of which is unknown. The most compelling one of them all was information that Fair got acquainted with Arpana's next door neighbor, CJ, that night and spent some time with him, the same neighbor who would go on to discover her body later. Some of the people at the party remembered that Fair had on a construction worker's costume, but most of them referred to him as that black guy. I'm not sure why her neighbor CJ was also not a suspect, but it looks like once investigators made a connection to Emmanuel Fair, he became the primary suspect, and investigation focused mostly on him. It was a failed strategy to begin with, and in the end, Arpana and her family paid the price. People at the party later recall seeing them, that is Fair and CJ, together. During the investigation, both of them admitted that it was true they met, but it was for the first time and lasted only for about 30 minutes. There were several inconsistencies in Fair's testimony. He had claimed that he was back in his friend Leslie's apartment before 1 a.m., but his call record showed he was making calls to more than one woman that night, and between 1 and 5 a.m., he had made several calls to Leslie, whose apartment he claimed to be sleeping in. If that was true, why had he called her multiple times during the early morning hours? In October 2010, charges were filed against Emmanuel Fair for the murder of Arpana Jinaga, based on evidence collected after over 2 years of investigation. According to prosecutors, they had found Fair's DNA on several items recovered at the crime scene. This included the tape used to gag Arpana, DNA recovered from her neck, and a bloody robe found in the garbage, which contained traces of Fair's DNA. Emmanuel Fair was charged with first-degree murder and was transferred to the King County Jail to await trial. Prosecutors made it clear they'd be pursuing a life sentence and not the 35 to 40-year sentence given for murder in the first degree due to the brutality of the crime. Fair pleaded not guilty. Fair's attorneys claimed that the investigators involved in the case had discriminated against him because of his race. Other suspects in the case, including Arpana's next-door neighbor CJ, had been treated differently despite having more incriminating evidence against them because they were white. They accused the investigators of not taking the other suspects seriously and focusing only on Emmanuel Fair because he was black. They also questioned the validity of DNA evidence prosecution was heavily reliant upon and disputed whether it was even admissible in court. We all know how important and crucial DNA evidence can be in these kind of cases. Usually, when they have to analyze a single sample of DNA, it is pretty straightforward. But when the samples they have are already degraded and came from multiple unknown sources, it becomes less reliable. In the case against Emmanuel Fair, they used a software program by Cybergenetics called TrueAllele. It analyzes DNA using statistical methods, a process called probabilistic genotyping. It is used in forensic identification. The program can be used in situations unsuited to traditional methods, such as when a mixture of multiple people's DNA is in a sample, which was the case in Arpana's murder. In fact, DNA from several men was found at the crime scene, including several of Arpana's neighbors and fellow partygoers. Some of these individuals had not even attended the Halloween party, which made the discovery of their DNA at the crime scene that much more surprising. Semen from an unnamed neighbor was found on a towel near Arpana's body, while another neighbor's DNA was found on a shoelace that had been used to strangle Arpana. This neighbor, according to the police, had an alibi for the time of the murder and had not been at the Halloween party that night. The same shoelace also contained Fair's DNA. These anomalies in DNA samples raised questions on the reliability of the evidence. There was an incident at the party in Arpana's apartment, and Emmanuel Fair ended up having a bloody lip. His defense said that might explain his DNA in her apartment. Defense also pointed out in the 2 years it took the authorities to arrest Fair, they were getting so desperate they had hired a psychic medium to help guide them. They argued the investigators were so desperate they would go to any lengths to make an arrest. Next was the evidence found in the apartment's dumpster, which police say contained Fair's DNA, but it was discovered 2 days after the body was found. That meant it was there for 5 days at that point, which also meant it was more likely to be compromised. Arpana's neighbors and their involvement also kept coming up throughout the trial. How police had failed to question them and look into them as closely because every resource they had was used to prove Fair as the killer, kind of sidelining other suspects. For all of these reasons and more, Emmanuel Fair's first trial ended in a hung jury, resulting in a mistrial. When the retrial was announced, this time the prosecution wanted to try the angle where Emmanuel Fair having done the crime with another accomplice, that being Arpana's next-door neighbor, CJ. Emmanuel Fair's second trial began in 2019. Just like in the first trial, the state leaned heavily upon the DNA evidence. During the second trial, the defense team argued Arpana's next-door neighbor CJ had as much incriminating evidence against him as Emmanuel Fair did. Police had failed to investigate him further. He had not only been one of the 2 people present when her body was first discovered, but also had behaved strange weeks leading up to the murder. During the investigation, it had come to light CJ had a prior relationship with the victim, and in the weeks leading up to her murder, the relationship had soured. So on paper, he made a much more compelling suspect than Fair, who had never met Arpana till that Halloween night. One more important thing to note here was, for whatever reason, jury was not informed of Fair's prior conviction. One in particular for SA on a minor for which he had served time. Neither were they made aware of the fact that his first trial was judged a mistrial. Prosecution did call CJ to the stand, and he of course denied all allegations against him. Unfortunately, they did not have enough evidence to prove his guilt with any certainty. That, and prosecution's failure to prove Fair's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, ruled the case in Emmanuel Fair's favor. Fair had spent nearly 9 years in prison at this point, 8 years and 7 months to be exact, without being convicted, most of which largely in isolation. Throughout, he maintained his innocence. So on 11th June 2019, after the second trial, jury found Emmanuel Fair not guilty. He was able to walk free. Since then, Fair has sued everyone involved, and to date, Arpana Jinaga's murder remains unsolved. After the end of second trial in 2019, there has been no movement in the case and it received little to no attention from the press at large. It appears from the start there were breaches of protocol, such as not training their detectives to change gloves between DNA samples and not securing key locations of the crime scene, to calling in a famous psychic medium to weigh in on the case. These protocol failures, in concert with the detectives' apparent racial discrimination, deprived Emmanuel Fair of his civil rights and denied Arpana Jinaga any chance at justice. As for Arpana's family and friends, they were denied justice too. The agony of having to go through the trial, not once but twice, and coming out without any answers at the end of it. In a case like this, where the details are hard enough to hear for a stranger like me, I cannot fathom how her family must have endured it all, knowing her last moments were filled with horror and in the end, justice was denied to her, is so unfair. There is nothing to suggest that Arpana's case might ever get solved. And on that sad note, we are at the end of today's video. Thank you for watching. Please do like, share and subscribe. If you would like to support me by buying me a coffee, link is in the description below. I appreciate the support. Until next time.